Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you again for connecting on this beautiful Shabbat. Today we continue with, in the book of Genesis, we'll be studying the Torah portion that's called Vayeshev. Vayeshev, which means, and he settled or and he lived. And that's going to be found in Genesis chapter 37, verse 1 through chapter 40, verse 23. But before we start, I would like to say the blessing of the Torah, which is something that I have neglected, and I apologize for that to you and also to our Heavenly Father for not doing that. So the Torah blessing says, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commanded us to engage ourselves in the words of the Torah. Amen and amen. So just to give you a small recap of last week's Torah portion, remember that Jacob is leaving Lavan, his father-in-law, and he encounters his brother Esau. And even though there's a reconciliation, really, Jacob still does not trust his brother, so they still go in different ways. Then he goes into Shechem or Shechem, where we see the incident where Dinah is raped and her brothers Simeon and Levi take vengeance by killing all the males in Shechem. And from there they move on towards where Isaac lives, towards the area of Beersheba or Hebron. And so at this point we have Jacob settled with his family, and this is where the story starts. But even though it kind of gives you the idea that everything is now okay, that everybody's settled, that everybody's in their place, we know that things don't continue quietly for very long. So in chapter 37, verse 1, it says, Jacob lived or settled in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph or Yosef in Hebrews is Yosef, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers. So right off the bat, we have here that the number 17 is important because the number 17 in Hebrew has to do with the word tov, tov, T-O-V, which is translated as good in English or bueno in Spanish, but it really lacks the meaning in Hebrew. Tov means that Joseph is complete, that there's nothing lacking in him, that he has all the potential to fulfill the destiny, the role, the function, and the purpose that God has put inside him. So 17 has to do with that. And if you recall, when Moses was born is the same term that it's used in Hebrew to describe Moses as a baby, that Moses was a tov baby. In other words, again, even at that age, being such a small baby, his mother could see in him the potential that God had implanted to fulfill his role, his purpose, and his function. So Joseph is described as being tov, complete, all the potential necessary to fulfill his purpose. And he was tending the flocks with his brothers. Again, we see this is a common theme among the people that follow Torah. They tend to be shepherds. Shepherds, they're always with goats and sheep. And it says, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. So this is something that anyone that has siblings is the worst thing that a sibling could do, to go to the parent and say, oh, so-and-so said, or so-and-so did. So this in Hebrew is seen as Lashon Hara, speaking evil or speaking gossip about someone, which is not seen in good eyes in Judaism. So verse 3 says, now Israel loved Yosef more than any of his sons. Here is the name Israel. Remember that every time the name Israel is mentioned instead of Jacob, we're seeing Israel in a higher spiritual level than when he's called just Jacob. So now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his sons, which really, if you are a parent, you know that that cannot be true. You love your children equally, but you might favor one more than another, maybe because they have characteristics that are akin to you, or there's something special about that child. But it's kind of unlikely that a father or parent would love a child, a son or daughter, more than the others. But it lets us know that he had favoritism with Joseph, the same way that Jacob favored Rachel over Leah. So now Israel loves Joseph more than any of his brothers because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made a robe for him. Now, depending on the translation that you're using, it can say a robe of many colors or an ornate robe, but really in the Hebrew, they use a term called pasim, pasim. And this is a word that's used mostly just in this portion of the Torah. It's not seen again. And according to the culture, according to the time, it most likely refers to a robe that was a tunic that was long, a tunic that probably had long sleeves and it was long to the ankles. Why? Because remember that in this culture, the way people dressed indicated their social status or indicated their rank or indicated how prominent they were within the family. So when Jacob gives Joseph this type of garment, this tunic or this robe, he is letting the family know that he has chosen Joseph in a way to be like the firstborn, to be the one responsible for the family. And one of the things that is explained in this culture is that these type of garments usually had sewn inside of them pockets where they would put all the legal documents pertaining to the family. For example, documents about property, documents that had to do with inheritance. So that is also another indication that Jacob was seeing Joseph as the person that would be taking care of the family, because Jacob could sense in Joseph something special, something special. And we'll see later that that's associated with some of the comments that Jacob says when uh, Joseph starts explaining his dreams. Verse 4, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Another thing about Joseph that we were going to notice is there's many parallels between Joseph and Yeshua. A lot of the things that happened to Joseph, we're going to see that happen also to Messiah. Verse 5, Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. So imagine the brothers saying, like, really? Because another thing we have to understand that during this time in this culture, dreams were seen as things, as messages coming from the gods. They saw it as something divine, that the dreams tended to have a message. So even during this time in the culture, many nations around Israel had people that were experts in interpreting dreams, or they had books written where they had symbols to be able to interpret dreams. Even in Egypt, there was a book called the Book of Dreams, where people that were experts would study these books and associate all the symbols of a dream to be able to give an interpretation. So dreams are important to the people during this time. And his brother said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. So they understood the dream. They understood the symbols of these dreams. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Again, during this time, it was understood that symbols like the sun, the moon, and the stars had to do with family. Like the sun would be the symbol of the father, the moon of the mother, the stars of the brothers. But there's two things going on here. First of all, the Torah says that when two dreams are the same, or at least the same message, even though it might be presented a little bit different, When it's the same message, it's something that is coming from God. It is a true message coming from God. So in the first one, we have sheaves. It has to do with harvest. And then the other one, we have signs in the heavens. Now, in Judaism, there is an understanding that the Messiah, there's two Messiahs. They talk about Messiah, son of Joseph, and they talk of Messiah, son of David. Now, if we take these two dreams, in a way, it pertains to those two concepts, except that we know there is only one Messiah with these two functions. The first time Yeshua came, he offered up his life during the time of Passover. And we know that during Passover, we have the harvest of barley. So these sheaves could represent the barley. Another thing that the Messiah, Ben Yosef, is understood to be a suffering Messiah, a suffering Messiah. And we see that really in the life of Yeshua. The first time he came to suffer, he came to give his life for us. But the next time he comes as king, and also these astronomical signs, these of the moon and the stars and the sun, is understood that when these things were seen in dreams, it was talking about kings and kingdoms. So here these two dreams, in a way, talk about Messiah, son of Joseph, the suffering servant, and then Messiah, son of David, the future king. Because anytime you read, especially when you're reading the book of Revelation, and it talks about stars falling to the sea and all these astronomical things happening in the heavens, these are signs and have to do with kingship. Most of the time, these things have to do with kings. So when you read about it, think about that it's talking about in a symbolic way of kings. So in verse 10, when he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Why? Because he was seeing something different in Joseph. And these dreams are symbols, or in a way are saying of what's going to happen in the future with the life of Joseph. So Jacob takes these things into heart. He keeps them in his heart, in his mind, wondering, what does this really mean? Is this really going to happen? And that you can also, if you remember, when Miriam, Yeshua's mom, when the first time that that they came to bring gifts to Yeshua as a toddler, she was wondering, what does all this mean? And and many times when Yeshua did miracles and stuff, she kept these things in her heart, because as a mother, she wondered about her son also. So in that, we can see the similarity with Yeshua. Verse 12, now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Yosef, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them. And this is kind of giving us an idea of what time in the year this is happening. Because if they're grazing so far away from where they live in Hebron, that means it's probably the time during the dry season. And so where they live, there's not enough grass and pastures for their flocks. So they have to move further north into Israel to pasture their flocks. And if you've been to Israel, you know that in the more northern parts of Israel is where the land is more green and there's more pasture, beautiful pasture for flocks and for cattle. Very well, he replied. So he said to him, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? He replied, I am looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks? They had moved on from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Dothan is even further north of Shechem, further away from where they lived. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance And before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. That also should remind us about Yeshua, when the religious Jews always, anytime Yeshua came and did something that they weren't in agreement with or they didn't like, they started plotting how to kill him, how to get rid of him. Verse 19, here comes that dreamer. They were mocking him. They said to each other, come now, let's kill and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. I mean, they were so mad with him and they hated him so much that they were willing to kill him because they didn't want those dreams to come true. So again, they throw him into a cistern. In Israel, you find cisterns in many places, especially in areas that are more dry. Because what they do is these cisterns are very deep, and when it rains or there's any flow of water, it gets into the cistern, and they use that to feed, to water their flocks. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. Now you have to remember that Reuben is the oldest. He feels responsible for Joseph. And not only that, remember that Reuben was not in good terms with his father because of what happened with Bilhah. So he's thinking maybe, okay, if something happens to Joseph, what am I going to do? Then I'm really going to be in trouble with my father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe. This is an act of shame. They're taking away his honor. They're taking away his authority. And you have to remember that the same thing happened to Yeshua when he was arrested. They stripped him of his clothes. They had him naked, and then they put um, some robes and the crown of thorn to mock him as a king, but he was stripped of his clothing, and that is shameful. So they took the robe he was wearing and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty, there was no water in it. And as they sat down to eat their meal, I mean, can you imagine? Poor Joseph is in the cistern, naked, probably cold, and his brothers are sitting down having a picnic while he's in there wondering what's going on, as he's probably screaming his head off, get me out of here. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. So from this, we understand that where they were in Dothan, it was a passageway of commerce where people would come and go through that passageway to go down to Egypt from the northern parts of Israel. They would gather their spices and go down to Egypt to sell, because there were a lot of things that you could find in Israel that you could not find in Egypt, so they would use these things to sell them. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. His brothers agreed. So now Judah takes the lead and he says, why kill him? Let's make some money out of him. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. Now here they use both terms, Ishmaelites and Midianites. So which one is it? The commentaries say that it was both, because they are families. These tribes are families. They're descendants from Abraham. Remember that the Midianites were descendants of Abraham through Keturah, while the Ishmaelites were descendants of Abraham through Hagar. And they were merchants. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. Remember that tearing the clothes is a sign of mourning, of grief. He went back to his brothers and said, the boy isn't there. Where can I turn now? So he said, what am I going to tell my father? Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in blood. Why a goat? Because the commentaries say that the blood of a goat is very similar to the blood of a human being. They took the robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." I mean, how cruel can you be to bring something like this to their elderly father, whom they know he loves Joseph so much, and bring this, and when it's not true, having him go through all this pain, all this anguish. He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Now, we know from other stories that there were ferocious animals in the land of Israel. Remember, there's many stories where lions are found, animals that would eat the lambs and the goats. We know that David fought against them. We know that Samson encountered a lion. So all these things were possible. So this is something that could have really happened. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. Traditionally, the culture says that it's 30 days of mourning. But in other commentaries, we know that really Jacob mourned his son Joseph for almost 22 years until he saw him. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Now, in chapter 38, there is a change of theme where we find the story of Judah and Tamar. And you're going to say, well, why is this put right here, smack in the middle of this, when we're talking about Joseph? Because we're going to see that Judah is going to take on a prominent role in the future when they again meet Joseph. And also, it's important to see how Judah, from being a person that was willing to kill his own brother, that had planned all these things, how to kill him, how to get rid of Joseph, how to deceive his father. And so he's going to have a transformation of character to the point that he's going to merit the kingship. Because remember that from Judah is the line of kings in Israel. Chapter 38. At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. Now, the question is, why did he move away? One of the commentaries say is that because he was the one that plotted how to get rid of Joseph, how to deceive his father, how to dip the robe in blood to make it look like he was devoured by a ferocious animal, that as time passed by, his brothers started saying, "It's your fault. It's because of you that our father is suffering. It's because of you, all his anguish." And so they started blaming him for what happened to Joseph. And they think that's why he kind of moved out away from the family. There, Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. So he marries a Canaanite woman, which we know is opposed to the Torah. He married her and made love to her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named Er. She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Keziv that she gave birth to him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Now, it doesn't say what he did to deserve to be killed at such a young age, because you have to remember that most of the time when young people were married, they usually were in their teens, 15, 16, 14. So he died at a very young age. And some commentaries think that it could have been because he had married a Canaanite woman. Maybe this was prone to follow the gods of his mother. Then Judah said to Onan, "Sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother." So this is what's called Levirate marriage. And this is later, when the Torah is given, is part of a national commandment. And the purpose is, if there's brothers and one is married and dies young without having any children, any descendants, it was supposed to be the obligation of the next brother in line to marry the widow. Also, the widow was probably very young. Tamar was probably very young. Again, 15, 16, 17 years old. And so it was up to his brother to marry her. So if when they have children, that first child would be like it would have been the child of the deceased. Why? Because it was honorable. It was to maintain the name of that first son. It was to maintain the inheritance for that son. Verse 9, but Onan knew that the child would not be his. It would be his biologically, but not in terms of inheritance. It would be like the child of his deceased brother. So whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. Why? Because spilling seed on the ground is an abomination to the Lord. Why? Because in the seed is life. So he's disregarding life. He's preferring death than life, than to give a child that would be in the name of his brother. And that to the Lord was an abomination, so he also kills him. 11, Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought, he may die too, just like his brother. So she was kind of like a black widow. So Tamar went to live in her father's household. But she goes with the promise that Shelah would be given to her. So in a way, she is betrothed to Shelah. So this is a promise. This is a vow. This is something that needs to be done eventually. So she goes to her father's house as a widow, because you also have to understand that during this time, even though she's young, if she's a widow that has had no children, in terms of social status, economy, finances, and legally, she has no rights. Okay? A widow with no children, with no husband, nothing in terms of finances, in terms of care, she's more like a burden than anything. And so no one's going to marry her, especially after knowing that two of her husbands are dead. After a long time, verse 12, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hira, the Adullamite, went with him. Now, in the culture, it was part of a custom that when the sheep were sheared, it would be like a festivity. It was a time of gladness and joy. And so the men would go and gather during this time, and it would be like a festival for them. So when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. Now, we also need to understand that clothing during this time let other people know their status. So widows wore a particular kind of garments. Women that were single wore garments that distinguished that. Women that were married wore different garments. People that were rich wore different garments. People that had different jobs wore different garments. So garments during this time told other people what was their social status. So she takes off her widow clothing and she goes to the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that though Shelah had grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. So now she's making her own plans to make sure that she has children. When Judah saw her, he thought that she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Apparently, during this time, prostitutes covered their face, and usually married women or single women did not cover their faces. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. Now, according to Torah, a father-in-law with his daughter-in-law cannot have sexual relationships because that is considered incest or an abomination, and that's going to be part of Torah. But you have to understand that Judah doesn't know that it's his daughter-in-law. And she says, "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" she asked. He said, "What pledge should I give you?" Now she's very smart, because listen to what she asked. "Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand." These were three items that during this time in the culture were used by men as something to distinguish them, especially when they had to do legal transactions, business. So the seal was something very particular that identified the individual. These seals were used to seal contracts, to seal transactions. It could have been like a signet ring. It could have been some sort of cylinder that they would make out of clay or sometimes out of metal, and they will wear this around their necks. Or it could have been something of that sort that he had that was only useful for Judah. And its cord, really, in the Hebrew, what they're talking about is probably tzitzit, the fringes on his clothing. Why? Because even the fringes were distinctive of the individual. And we know that sometimes they use these to kind of like signing a contract. What they would do is if they had a fresh clay, a tablet made out of clay that was fresh, that had a contract written, what they would do is use the tzitzit, the cord, and press it on the tablet and would make a distinctive mark. And that would mean that this was the signature of this individual. And then the staff during this time, most men had staffs. Why? Because these staffs had special designs made on the top of the staff that was also very distinctive of the individual. So here he's giving her three items that there was never going to be any doubt that these belong to Judah. So she's smart because she knows what's going to happen. So she takes these three items, and it says, "Your seal and his cord and the staff in your hand." She answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. So he didn't even think about it. I mean, he's giving her completely his complete identity, everything that's going to point to him. He didn't even think about it at all. He just gave it to her. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend, the Adullamite, in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he did not find her. He asked the man who lived there, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim?" In the Hebrew, two terms are used to describe Tamar. One of them is Kadesha. Kadesha was known as a sacred or shrine prostitute, a woman that was dedicated to a pagan god, a pagan temple where sex was part of a ritual as a cult to this pagan god. So they talk about her as being one of these types of prostitutes. "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here," they said. So he went back to Judah and said, "I didn't find her. Besides, the men who lived there said there hasn't been any shrine prostitute here." Then Judah said, "Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughing stock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant." Because you have to remember, she's a widow. She has been promised Sheila, so there is a sort of a betrothal between her and Sheila. And even though she hasn't remarried, all of a sudden she's pregnant. What are they going to think? She's been like a harlot. She's been doing things on her own without any respect of this matter as a widow. Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." Because we know that adultery and a betrothed woman that has sex with another man is considered adultery. So they see that her pregnancy is secondary to adultery. And the matter of how do you deal with adultery? Death. People that committed adultery, they had to be killed. But he says to burn her. Now, one of the commentaries says that why does he say to burn her? Because usually, and we'll see that later on in the Torah as one of the commandments, that a daughter of a priest that commits fornication or adultery had to be killed by burning. So the commentaries come to the conclusion that she was the daughter of Shem, who was also known as Melchizedek, who was a priest. So that's why he said to burn her. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father in law. I am pregnant by the man who owns these, she said. And she added, see if you recognize these whose seal and cord and staff these are. Like I said, there was going to be no doubt at all that these belong to Judah. Of course, Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her up to my son Shelah. And he did not sleep with her again. So he sees that he was wrong by not fulfilling the promise of having her marry Sheila when Sheila was already at a marrying age. So she took the issue into her own hands, and he recognizes that what she did was righteous. What she did was right because she wanted children. And one of the things that the commentaries say is that Tamar felt in her spirit that her descendants would be associated with the future Messiah. So she wanted children. She wanted children because she believed in that. And remember, during this time in this culture, a woman without children is shameful. It's shameful. And in society, it would have been a problematic issue. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twins, boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand, so the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, this one came out first. But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, so this is how you have broken out. And he was named Perez. Perez, which is uh, a common name in Hispanic, in the Hispanic population, Perez. But in the Hebrew, it's Peretz, Peretz, and it means a breach. Someone that makes a breaker, makes a breach that breaks into something. And then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was named Zerah. In the Hebrew, Zerach, Zerach, which means uh, um, to be born, or to something that's very radiant, like the morning light. And we know when you look up in Isaiah 60, Isaiah chapter 60, verses 1 to 3, this term Zerach in the Hebrew is used 3 times to describe the light that shines upon Zion, upon Zion. It has to do with the light of Messiah. So again, this is related to the Messiah. And also when you read in the book of Ruth in chapter 4, it talks about the genealogy, and they mention that it is through the sons of Judah that continues the line towards the Messiah, or the line of the kings of Israel. Now, chapter 39, we go back to the story of Joseph. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. So when the Lord blesses Joseph, he also blesses everything that's around him. The same thing happened with Jacob when he was with Laban. Because of Jacob, Laban was also blessed. And it's something that we should take to heart also, that because the Lord blesses us, Anyone that surrounds us is also blessed. So you become a blessing to others, whether they deserve it or not. The blessing of the Lord was in everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care, with Joseph in charge. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. So we know that Joseph has administrative skills. He's taking care of everything. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. Now, one of the things that the commentaries say is that Joseph looked a lot like his mom, Rachel. And maybe that's why Jacob favored him more, because it reminded him of his wife, Rachel, who he loved very much. So he's very well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" I mean, he's talking about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's talking about the God that he believes in because of his family. What he saw was his father Jacob in Bethel. What he saw was his grandfather Isaac, the stories of Abraham. So he knows, and plus the dreams that he's had. So he has not lost faith in spite of all the things that have happened to him. And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house, because probably his clothing were kind of loose. So she grabs him by the clothes, but he runs away. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us." Hebrew, the term Hebrew here is used as a derogatory form. Why? Because the Hebrews to the Egyptians were always seen as inferior people. They were disliked by the Egyptians. So when she says Hebrew, basically is a demeaning term when she says that. "He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard the scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him the story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, 'This is how your slave treated me.' He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined." Now you have to understand that an incident of apparent rape or adultery, the punishment was immediate death. And adultery and rape, even in cultures outside of Israel, is not seen with a good eye. These are offenses that merit death. Punishment is always death. So what happens here? We see that Potiphar is very angry, yet he does not have Joseph killed. So is it possible that he's angry with his wife because he knows that it was not Joseph, but his wife who probably was seducing Joseph? Why? Because Joseph has spent years of showing that he's responsible, that he's honest, that he is a blessing, that he has never done anything wrong in the eyes of his master. And for this to happen, so I really believe that Potiphar does not believe his wife. And instead of having Joseph killed, he sends him to a prison where officials of the king were sent there, which means that this is not a regular prison. This is not a prison of criminals. This is a prison where elite people, officials of the king, were sent there for a while until judgment was done for whatever thing they had done. So in a way, this is almost like a luxurious prison. So even that, he sends him to a place where he's going to be comfortable. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The wardens paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Again, the favor and the blessing of the Lord is upon Joseph. And the interesting thing about this is we don't hear Joseph complaining and telling God, why have you sent me here? Why did you take me away from my family? You've brought me to a land that I don't know, a language that I don't know. And no, he's in all times he's quiet, believing what the Lord has put in him, trusting God. So in chapter 40, what we have is that there's of the prisoner, there's two prisoners with whom Joseph has favor in the sense that he gets to know them. One of them is the cupbearer and the other one is the baker. Now, the cupbearer, we know that this was a position of which Nehemiah, the prophet, was also a cupbearer to the king of Persia, where the cupbearer, his responsibility was to taste anything that was given to the king to drink. Because if for by any chance the drink was poison, the cupbearer would drink it first and he would die, therefore saving the life of the king. So these two positions were positions of trust and confidence. You don't give this kind of position to anybody. You have to trust the person to make sure they're loyal and faithful, to make sure that if they're given any drink or food, that they would try it first to make sure that the king was not going to be poisoned. The same thing with the baker. Even though they say baker, many times the term lechem, which we translate as bread, is also a term that's used for any kind of food. So the baker also was responsible to make sure that what was given to Pharaoh or to the king was not poison. So these two guys have two dreams, which are kind of similar, but they're anguished because they don't understand what the dreams mean. And so Joseph sees that they're anguished and asks them what's going on. And they tell him about the dreams, but they have no one to interpret it. Verse 8 of chapter 40 says, we both had dreams. They answered, but there is no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. Now, this is opposite to the belief of this time about dreams, because the dreams, even though the culture understood that they were dreams from the gods, they knew that the gods would never tell them what the dreams meant. So that's why they had all these books with all these symbols of all these dreams and experts to interpret the dreams, because they believed that the gods would never interpret the dreams for them. But yet, Joseph says the opposite. He believes and understands that the dreams come from God and God will give the interpretation. So the cupbearer tells his dream first and Joseph interprets it. And he says, verse 12, this is what it means. Joseph said to him, the 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews. In other words, he was kidnapped. That too is against Torah. He was sold as a slave. That too is against Torah. And even here, I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon, because he knows what the wife of Potiphar said is also a lie. When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. This is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh. Now, the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday. So one of the things the commentaries say is, why does Joseph say in 3 days instead of 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years, that these things were going to happen? because it was known in the community, it was known all over Egypt that it was Pharaoh's birthday. And part of the culture during the time when a king had a birthday, one of the things they would do is release a prisoner. They would pardon somebody. And so they knew that this was going to happen within 3 days. So that's why Joseph can make the association that the items in the dream that were in triplets pertain to the following 3 days in reference to Pharaoh's birthday. Now, the third day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he once again put the cup in Pharaoh's hand, but he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. So with that, we finished the Torah portion related to Joseph. And so we have Joseph stuck in prison, still there for another couple of years, and no one remembers him. So we're going to take some time for questions